Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading E. Franklin Frazier's Black Bourgeoisie, starting on page number 42, The Economic Basis of the Middle Class Status.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Chapter 2, The Economic Basis of Middle Class Status. The Black bourgeoisie is constituted of those Negroes who derive their incomes principally from the services which they render as white-collar workers. Despite the dreams of Negro leaders at the turn of the century that Negro businessmen would become organizers of big industries and large financial undertakings, Negroes have not become captains of industry nor even managers of large corporations. Through the slow occupational differentiation of the Negro population, which was accelerated as a result of the migrations to northern cities and the changes in the American economy during 2 world wars, a class of white-collar workers has acquired a dominant position among Negroes. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks for tuning in. What has come to be known as Negro business has consisted chiefly, with the exception of a few insurance companies, of a number of small banks and newspapers, of some small retail stores, restaurants, undertaking establishments, and similar enterprises which serve the needs of the segregated Negro communities. So, what he's saying here is that these companies are small. We had a few banks, newspapers, a couple of stores, food service or restaurants, the funeral home business, and things that serve the needs of the segregated Negro communities because they were segregated. This is where a lot of people get the idea that during segregation we were better off because we at least had to support Black businesses because we were not welcome to support white businesses. Since the Black bourgeoisie has always derived its income principally from white-collar occupations, we shall give attention first to the increasing occupational differentiation of the Negro population over the years. So he's going to talk about the different jobs we had throughout the years that he had during his study. Increasing occupational differentiation of the Negro population. In 1900, when 9/10 of the Negroes were still in the South and 4/5 of those in the South lived in rural areas, 60% of the Negroes derived, derived their living from agriculture. 10 years later, the situation had changed only slightly, since 55% continued to work on the soil. By 1910, both the number and percentage of owners among Negro farmers had reached their maximum. 1/4 of the Negro farmers had managed to buy their farms, while the other 3/4 were tenants, the majority of whom were mere sharecroppers. The vast majority of Negro workers who were not in agriculture worked as unskilled laborers or in domestic service. So they were maids or pickers. A small professional group comprising between 2 and 3% of all workers and an even smaller group of clerical workers had gradually become differentiated from the Negro masses. So they set themselves apart from the mass of people. So this was not common work. A definite change occurred in the occupational distribution of the Negro population as the result of the northward migrations, which began in 1915. By 1920, the proportion of Negroes in the North had increased to 14.1%, and 5/6 of those in the North were in cities, principally large cities. So think St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, New York. They were in those places. In the South, the number and proportion of Negroes in agriculture had declined markedly as the result of the movement of Negroes into the numerous small towns and cities of the South, as well as into northern industrial centers. The Negro migrants to southern cities tended to swell the number of Negroes who gained a living from unskilled labor and domestic service. On the other hand, in the northern cities, Negroes began to enter occupations from which they had previously been barred. This was due to a number of reasons: the absence of the rigid color bar to the Negro's employment in certain types of occupations. The color bar is the brown paper bag test. Better educational opportunities, so they were being educated better. The Negro's newly acquired political power, and a wider range of employment opportunities, including those created by the large Negro communities. So they had better jobs because their communities were growing. For example, in the South, the only opportunity for Negro clerical employment had been in a Negro business or in a Negro school, while in the North, large numbers of Negroes were able to secure employment as clerks in public service as the result of the Negro's participation in political life. When the Depression broke in 1930, Negro workers in both northern and southern cities were forced out of their usual employment to a larger extent than white workers. Remember, last hired, first fired. Many of them were forced back into domestic service, but 2/3 of them continued to depend upon occupations outside of agriculture for a livelihood. Even in the South, less than half of the employed Negroes were in agriculture. In the North, the Negro workers had secured for the first time a foothold in American industry, and this foothold was not lost during the Depression. Moreover, in northern cities, Negroes had an opportunity to participate in various relief projects on the basis of their skills and education. Although the Depression tended to slow up the occupational differentiation of the Negro population, it did not stop altogether. So all of their opportunities were not shut down. Greetings, forecast. Thanks for tuning in. The extent to which the Negro population had become differentiated occupationally by 1940 can be seen by studying the situation in the 11 cities in the United States which had Negro communities numbering 100,000 or more in 1940. These 11 cities, 4 southern, 3 border, and 4 northern, had a total Negro population of more than 2 million, with more than a million Negroes being in the 4 northern cities. In the southern cities, the small professional group accounted for only about 3% of the employed males. The proprietors were relatively more numerous in northern cities than in southern cities. The most important difference appeared in regard to the clerical workers. In all of the northern cities, the clerical workers constituted a much larger proportion of Negro workers than their same group in southern or border cities, with the exception of Washington. He's talking about Washington, D.C., Chocolate City, which has been known for a long time to be a place of opportunity for Black people, but the cost of living there is high. This is explained by the fact that in Washington, a relatively large proportion of Negroes were employed by the federal government. The advantage enjoyed by northern cities was due to the reasons which we have indicated. There was a little difference between northern cities and southern cities in regard to skilled craftsmen, except in the case of Detroit, which had the largest percentage of skilled Negro craftsmen. In respect to skilled craftsmen, both northern and southern cities had a larger proportion of this occupational group than border cities. But in northern cities, a smaller percentage of Negroes were employed as common laborers than in southern and border cities. So if you didn't have any skills, you probably worked in the South or in these border cities. On the basis of the occupational distribution of Negroes in these cities, it appeared that in southern and border cities, the Black bourgeoisie constituted about 1/6 of the Negro population, while in northern cities, it constituted a little more than 1/5 of the Negro population. The Negro community in Washington, with a Black bourgeoisie as large as northern cities, deviated from the border pattern because of the employment of Negroes in the federal government. So even though the government could be desegregated and offer opportunities to Blacks, that doesn't mean the states were. And this is where that whole conversation and the thoughts about states' rights and why certain states remain segregated so long comes into play. Occupational status and incomes. We may get a better idea of the size and character of the Black bourgeoisie in the United States by considering the proportion of Negro male workers in those occupations which the Black bourgeoisie derives its income from. It is shown for the employed male Negro population in Table 1, which I'll go over in a moment, that according to the figures in this table, about 1/6 of the Negro men in the United States were employed in occupations which identified them with the Black bourgeoisie. It will be observed, however, that in proportion of the Negro men so employed in the North and West is twice as great as that in the South. And so what it says is that there are 4 major occupational groups. There are the professional and technical groups throughout the United States, 2.2% of them. In the United States, 2.2% of the Black male population is employed, and of that percentage, 1.9% is employed in the South, 2.6% in the North, 3% in the West. So the West was the best place for professional and technical, but there's not a large proportion of Negroes living in the West. Then we have managers, officials, and proprietors. This would include people running offices, people owning businesses, and public officials. 2.1% in the United States overall, 1.7% in the South, 3% in the North, and 2.8% in the West. Clerical sales, etc. These are your insurance salesmen, your traveling salesmen. These are your clerks that work in the government. These are those people. 4.3% overall in the United States are Black men. 2.5% of those men are in the South, 8.1 are in the North, and 8.5 are in the West. Then we have craftsmen, foremen, and etc. So these are people that could be independent contractors or work for themselves. These are your cabinet makers, your masons. These are those people. 7.7% in total in the United States, 6.3% in the South, 10.7% in the North, and 10.3% in the West. So in the North, the Masons were the largest group. Okay. And this is based upon the U.S. Census Bureau data for 1950, Census of the Population Special Report, Chapter B, Non-White Population by Race. This difference becomes even more significant when we consider the variations for the different occupational groups. Beginning with the professional and technical group, we find that it is relatively small in all sections of the country, though it is larger in the North and the West than in the South. The proportion of Negroes in professional and technical occupations is less than 1/3 as large as the proportion is among white Americans. Among Negroes of this group, it includes principally school teachers, preachers, physicians, dentists, lawyers, college professors, entertainers, embalmers, funeral directors, social workers, and nurses, and only a small sprinkling of persons in the technical occupations such as architecture, engineering, and chemistry. But it should be pointed out that the Negro professional group in the North is represented by a much wider range of occupations, especially in regards to technical occupations, in which Negroes are seldom found in the South. So they don't get the education usually in the South, or once they get the education in the South, they leave with that knowledge. These same differences between the North and West on the one hand and the South on the other appear in the next occupational group, designated as managers, officials, and proprietors, such as this is exclusive of farm owners. In the white population, 1 out of every 7 males employed is in this occupational group, whereas only 1 in 30 employed Negro males was in the North and West, and only 1 in 50 in the South is in this category. This occupational group includes buyers, postmasters, public administration officials, credit men, purchasing agents, shippers of farm products, railroad conductors, and union officials, as well as proprietors of business enterprises. Negroes are not permitted to work in a number of these occupations. For example, they cannot be railroad conductors because the Brotherhood of Railroad Conductors excludes all persons of Negro descent. In some of these occupations, they may be found in small numbers because of exceptional circumstances, such as passing or a rail that only has a route going through the North and the West. The relative size of the Black bourgeoisie in the Negro population has increased during the past decade, largely because of the Negro workers in clerical and kindred occupations has more than doubled, and the proportion of female clerical workers quadrupled since 1940. So they forced our women into the workforce. In 1940, the proportion of employed Negro males in clerical and kindred fields was slightly more than 2%, and the proportion of employed females slightly more than 1%. The significance of this sudden increase appears to be more striking when one considers it in relation to white workers in the same category. The proportion of Negro male workers in this category, which was one-fourth as large as white male workers in 1940, became one-half as large in 1950. During the same period, the proportion of Negro female workers in clerical services, which was less than 1/20th as large as that for white female workers, has become 1/7 as large. So they were continuing to integrate women into the workforce. These changes must be considered in connection with the figures on the proportion of Negro clerical workers for the different regions of the United States shown in the table we previously discussed. The increase in the proportion of Negro men and women in clerical occupations has not occurred in the South, but in the North and the West. This group of occupation includes bank tellers, bookkeepers, cashiers, secretaries, stenographers, telephone and telegraph operators, mail carriers, and railway mail clerks, all, with the exception of the last two, being occupations from which Negroes are barred in the South unless they work in a Negro school or a Negro business establishment. During and especially since World War II, Negro men and women in the North have been entering clerical occupations, both in public and private employment. That's for the government and for private enterprise as well. As the result of political pressure and the Fair Employment Practices laws enacted in 11 states and 25 cities. We finally come to the occupational group craftsmen, foremen, and kindred workers, which constitutes, on the whole, the lower middle class and is therefore identified with the Black bourgeoisie. This group, which includes chiefly the skilled workers among Negroes, increased during World War II. In 1940, the proportion of Negro workers in this group was slightly more than one-third the proportion among white workers, whereas in 1950, the proportion of Negro workers in this category was almost half that of whites. While there was an increase in the proportion of craftsmen among Negro workers in the South as well as in the North, the increase was greater in the North, and this occupational group is relatively larger in the North. The increase in craftsmen is due to the more liberal policy of the labor unions, especially in the North, as well as the laws which have been enacted recently against discrimination in employment. It is not possible to secure exact information on the incomes of Negroes who constitute the Black bourgeoisie. In 1949, the median income of Negro families in the United States was $1,665, or 51% of the median income of white families, which was $3,232. Only 16% of the Negro families, as compared with 55% of the white families, had incomes of $3,000 or more. There were important differences between regions, as one may see from the following table of distribution of the incomes of all Negroes with incomes in 1949. The fact that 38.6% of the Negro males in the South earn less than $500 a year is compared with 14.7% in the North and 17.2% in the West is due partly to the large number of Negroes in agriculture. So in the United States, overall, 30.6% of Negroes with incomes earned less than $500. In the South, it was a slightly higher number, 38.6%. In the North, it was 14.7%. And in the West, it was 17.2%. In the United States, 21.3% of Negroes with incomes earn between $500 and $999. In the South, it was slightly higher at 23.8%. In the North, it was a little less at 16.1%. And in the West, it was 18.2%. 14.9% of Negroes earned between $1,000 and $1,499 in all of the United States. And it was 14.9% in the South, 14.9% in the North, and 14.3% in the West. 11.6% of Negroes earned between $1,500 and $1,999. It was 10.3% in the South, 14.4% in the North, 12.3% in the West. 9.8% of all Negroes earned between $2,000 and $2,499 per year in the United States. That number was 6.7% in the South, 16% in the North, and 14.6% in the West. Excuse me. 5.6% of Negroes earned between $2,500 and $2,999 in the United States in 1949. 2.9% of those were in the South, 10.9% of those were in the North, and 10.7% of those earning that particular amount of money, just under $3,000, was in the West. 4.7% of all Negroes earned between $3,000 and $3,999 in the United States. 1.9% of those were in the South, 10.1% of those were in the North, and 9.8% of those were in the West. 0.8 of a percent of Negroes earned between $4,000 and $4,999. 0.4 of those were in the South, 1.6% of those were in the North, and 1.6% of those were in the West. 0.2 of a percent of Negroes earned between $5,000 and $5,999. 0.1 of those were in the South, 0.5%, 0.5% were in the North, and 0.5% were in the West. 0.3 of a percent earned $6,000 or more. Okay. 0.2 of those were in the South, 0.5, 0.5% of those were in the North, and 0.5% of those were in the West. So as you can see, as the incomes got larger, there were fewer living in the north and in the excuse me, there were much fewer living in the south than there were living in the north or in the western parts of the country. But this is not the only explanation, since the median income of Negroes in southern cities was $861 as compared with $1,665 in northern cities. In the table we just discussed, one can see the same significant differences between the incomes of Negroes in the North and the West and the South at all levels of income. On the basis of the information given in the table we just discussed, it has been possible to estimate the incomes of Negroes who derive their incomes from the occupations in Table 1. For the country as a whole, the incomes of the members of the Black bourgeoisie range from $2,000 and $2,225 and upwards. The majority of their incomes do not amount to as much as $4,000. In fact, scarcely more than 1% of all the Negroes in the country have an income amounting to $4,000, and only one half of 1% of them has an income of $5,000 or more. In the South, the incomes of the Black bourgeoisie begin at $2,000, and the majority of them do not reach $3,000. Only 0.7%, or 7 Negroes in every 1,000 with incomes in the South have incomes amounting to $4,000 or more. On the other hand, in the North and in the West, the incomes of the Black bourgeoisie begin at 2,500. Although the majority of their incomes are less than 4,000, nearly a half of them are between $3,000 and $4,000. Moreover, whereas in the South, less than 1% of the Negroes have incomes of $4,000 or more, in the North and West, slightly more than 2% have incomes within this income bracket. And 1 Negro in every 100 with incomes has an income of $5,000 or more. These income figures show clearly that the Black bourgeoisie is comprised essentially of white-collar workers. The less than 1% of Negroes with incomes between $4,000 and $5,000 and who are at the top of the pyramid of the Negro bourgeoisie have incomes about equal to the median income of white-collar workers among whites. So the top of the Black pyramid is about the median income of white-collar workers that are white. The extremely small proportion, 5 in every 1,000, of Negroes whose annual incomes amount to $5,000 or more includes principally physicians, dentists, entertainers, lawyers, and businessmen. I'll remind you here of a joke that Chris Rock once said. He said he lived in his neighborhood and his next nearest neighbor was like a dentist, just a regular dentist, and he was at the top of the comedy game at the time. And his next nearest neighbor was just some regular dentist. So our elite live where their median people live. The relatively large incomes of the Negroes in the professions are due partly to their business activities. A study made some years ago showed that 32% of the Negro physicians and 13.5% of the Negro dentists were engaged in business activities. In this same income bracket of $5,000 or more, there are a few college professors, public school principals, and persons employed in the federal, state, and municipal governments. The businessmen with incomes of $5,000 or more are to be found in the occupational group designated as managers, proprietors, and officials. Some of these businessmen include Negroes who have been successful in reaching the top in the rackets in the United States. In Chicago, for example, where the policy racket is a big business, this business was until recently organized as a cartel in a syndicate of 15 men, including 12 Negroes. The role of these businessmen in the life of the Black bourgeoisie will be discussed later. We shall turn our attention to legitimate Negro business as a source of income for the Black bourgeoisie. Negro businesses. Negro businesses are those enterprises which are owned and operated by Negroes. These business enterprises come with the definition of small business, within the definition of small business. In fact, they fall within the lowest category of small businesses. When the first study was made of Negro business in 1898, it was found that the average capital investment for the 1906 businesses giving information amounted to only $4,600. When the latest study of the Negro businesses was made in 1944, it was revealed that the average volume of business of the 3,866 Negro businesses in 12 cities was only $3,260. The vast majority, 90.5%, of these businesses were retail stores, 42.5%, and service industries establishments at 48%. Although Negro businesses are operated primarily for Negroes, the total volume of sales of food stores, according to the United States Census Bureau in 1939, was only $24,037,000, or less than $2 for each Negro in the United States. The food stores constituted 37% of the retail stores owned and operated by Negroes. Next in importance to food stores were eating places, with which, together with drinking places, comprised over 40% of the retail stores, so bars and restaurants. The remainder of the retail stores included filling stations, drugstores, liquor stores, secondhand stores, hardware stores, and a variety of small stores. In 1939, there were nearly 30,000 retail stores owned and operated by Negroes, with total sales amounting to about $71.5 million. According to the 1944 study of Negro business, 80% of all Negro businesses were operated by their owners. So were they businesses, or were they these solopreneurs that we talk about today? As one may see from Table 3, about 70% of these stores were located in the southern states, although only 27% of these retail stores were in the north. Their sales amounted to nearly 40% of the total sales of all retail stores, and the payrolls in the North accounted for 50% of the total. In fact, three northern states, New York, Illinois, and Ohio, accounted for 25% of the total payrolls of Negro stores in the United States. Moreover, nearly 40% of employees were in the stores in the United States. As we have seen above, Nearly a half of the Negro businesses are what we call service establishments. These businesses have grown up to serve the needs of Negroes, principally because of the refusal on the part of white establishments to provide personal services for Negroes. That's the biggest reason for Black business, because white people refuse to serve Black people. And we have to get a preference for being served by Black people, okay? So that Black business can thrive again. Therefore, the majority, over 80%, of these businesses consist of beauty shops, barber shops, cleaning and pressing places, undertakers, and shoe repair shops. The remainder of the businesses in this group are concerned with automobile repair and services and with various other types of repair services. One may get a notion of the nature of Negro business in the North by considering first the situation in Chicago. During the 15 years prior to the mass migration from the South, the number of Negro businesses reached 500. The majority of these enterprises were in the service field, with barber shops and moving and storage establishments forming the majority of the enterprises. It was the mass migrations from the South during and following World War I that created the Negro market in Chicago, which Negro businesses sprang up to serve. So Negro businesses sprang up to serve the Negro population that was moving from the South to the North because of mass migration. When segregation ended, everybody boycotted Black businesses, including Black people, because Black people were sold on the idea that just because a white person will take your money means that they respect you. And that's not true. Now, there's a chart here for the number of Negro owned businesses, Negro owned retail stores, their sales, the number of full and part time employees they had, their payroll, and their stock, according to the geographic divisions in 1939. So in the North, there were 8,272 stores. Their sales were in the 29,028. They had 4,106 full-time employees, 1,319 part-time employees. Their payroll was 2,727,000, and the stock on hand at the end of the year was 1,326. It was valued at that. In the North, there were 20,825 stores. So there were more stores. There were 39,364 in sales. There were 5,756 full-time employees. There were 2,014 part-time employees, but their payroll was less. And the payroll was 2,344,000. So they employed more people, they had more stores, but they were paying them less. And these were all mostly owned and operated by the same people. And the stock that they had on hand at the end of the year was 1,543,000. In the West, there were 730 stores. Their sales were $3,074,000. They had 358 full-time employees, 225 part-time employees. Their payroll was $305,000, and their stock on hand at the end of the year was $173,000. So as you can see, although They had more stores in the South to provide for the Negro population that wasn't being served by the white population. They paid them less because they had more employees. Conspicuous among the Negro businesses were the two banks and four insurance companies. During the Depression, the two Negro banks failed and many of the larger business establishments were wiped out. At the same time, the smaller businesses increased in number because unemployed Negroes with small savings opened small stores as a means of securing a living. In 1938, there were about 2,600 Negro businesses in Chicago. Of Of the 10 most numerous establishments, there were 287 beauty parlors, 257 groceries, 207 barbershops, 163 tailors, cleaners, and pressers, and 145 restaurants. The remaining five most numerous types of business, coal and wood dealers, taverns, undertakers, shoe repairing, and dressmaking, were represented by less than 100 establishments. There were 2,800 white businesses which received more than 9/10 of the money spent by Negroes. So we were spending our money with white people even back then because we wanted to. The situation of Negro business enterprises in the Harlem Negro community in New York was similar to that in Chicago. A survey of 52 of the 78 census tracts in the Harlem area, or those in which 1% or more of the total population was Negro, showed that Negroes conducted 1,928, or 18.6%, of the 10,319 businesses. The main type of businesses engaged in by Negroes differed considerably from the chief businesses in which whites were engaged. More than a third, or 36.5%, of the Negro businesses provided personal services, such as barbershops, beauty parlors, and cleaning and pressing shops. On the other hand, 36.3% of the businesses conducted by whites, as compared with 18.4% of the Negro businesses, provided for the basic needs of the Negro community. Listen to these businesses because these are the businesses that provide for a community. These businesses included grocery stores, meat markets, bakeries, coal and ice companies, restaurants and clothing, department and furniture stores. Those are some of the businesses that will meet the essential needs because everybody's got to eat, you got to be warm, you got to have something to cool your drinks off, you got to have clothes on your back, you got to have furniture for your house. So those are businesses that provide for the basic needs of a community. Moreover, a closer inspection of the types of businesses in general in this general class shows that the majority of Negro businesses providing the basic needs of Harlem were restaurants. We now turn to the Negro banks, newspapers, and life insurance companies, which are regarded as the major achievements of Negroes in the field of business. According to the 1951 report of the United States Department of Commerce, there were 14 banks owned and operated by Negroes with total assets amounting to 32 million and total deposits being 29 million. All of these banks were located in the South with the exception of one in Philadelphia, another in Washington, D.C., and a third in Kansas City, Kansas. According to the study made in 1944, these banks employed from 3 persons in the smallest banks to 15 persons in the largest institutions. In connection with the banks, there should be mentioned the financial operations of the 25 savings and loans associations owned and operated by Negroes, which had total assets amounting to $16 million in 1949. Only passing attention need be given to the consumers' cooperatives here, since cooperatives did not develop among Negroes until the 30s, and only 2 of the 11 cooperatives of any importance do an annual business of over $10,000. So we didn't really participate in co ops like that. According to the most recent reports, there are in the United States 169 Negro newspapers, 85 of which are published in the South, 66 in the North, and 18 in the West. All of these newspapers are weeklies with the exception of 5, which appear semi weekly, and 2 dailies. Although only a third of the Negro population is in the North, the 66 newspapers published there have 56% of the total circulation of Negro newspapers. 5 of the leading newspapers have nearly half of the total circulation of Negro newspapers, which is more than 2 million a week. 4 of the newspapers with the largest circulation are in the North and 1 in the South. Although it is difficult to get information on the amount of capital investment represented in Negro newspapers, reliable estimates indicate that their total valuation is close to $10 million. It has been estimated that Negro newspapers provide full-time or part-time employment for about 6,000 persons. We come finally to the Negro insurance companies, which are the largest business enterprises owned and operated by Negroes. In 1945, there were 44 member companies of the National Negro Insurance Association. The member companies have been operating on an average of 24 years and were classified as follows: 30 were legal reserve companies, 8 assessment and mutual aid companies, 5 burial insurance companies, 1 fraternal organization. These 44 companies had a total of over 4 million policies in force, of which 232,441 were ordinary policies and 3,860,890 were industrial or health and accident, and the remainder were unspecified. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight? We're almost done. The median average size of the ordinary policies of the 20 companies for which information was available was $690, while the median size of the industrial policies of the 41 companies was $140. The 44 companies had a total income of $42 million in 1945, and disbursements amounted to over 30 million, nearly one half of which was paid to the employees in the 40 companies which reported on this phase of their operations. With the exception of cosmetic manufacturers, which employ on average of 37 cab companies, 29 persons, the insurance companies employ a higher number of employees, 24.4 persons on average in their branch offices, than any other Negro business. Having given this account, of the economic basis of the Black bourgeoisie, we shall direct attention to the next chapter in the manner in which the mind and outlook of this class of the Negro population has been shaped principally by educational institutions. Greetings, Brother Bakari. How are you tonight? Thank you so much for tuning in. But as you can see, insurance companies were a big business and paid a lot of money to a lot of people in the Negro bourgeoisie. And that's why we cannot stop harping on financial literacy for our people, because insurance policies are one of the greatest ways to transfer wealth from one generation to the other. Because when you die, if you leave something for your children and your children's children, they will inherit that money and then they will have a better start. I know it sounds morbid. I just lost my mom last year, and I know it sounds morbid, but and she did not have the necessary financial education that she needed in order to do the right thing. But we have to get to the point where we are educating our people that insurance policies are the way in which wealth is created for one generation to the next. That's how it's created. All right, guys. Did you guys want to talk about anything discussed tonight? Did you want to discuss some of these numbers and why do you think it is he focused on Negro males? Because males were the breadwinners and women had not been fully integrated into the workforce at this time. Do you think that integrating women into the workforce was something that was necessary to get lower cost employees into the workforce? Do you think that the Negro bourgeoisie had these people working and showing that they were able to do this type of work um, just to improve their status? Is it a bigger flex to have a woman that works a job that's prestigious? Or is it a bigger flex to have a woman that doesn't have to work, but you can totally take care of her? As a woman, I would say it's a bigger flex to be able to have a housewife. Um, I don't know, how do you guys feel about that? Leave me a message in the comments. I want to thank KW Dom 7, The Forecast, Brother Bakari, and Anthony McPhail for showing up today. I know that Sister Raw and the elders are listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast is listening. I know that Oni from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. I know that the staff at Jesse's Kids and the Daycare Ladies Network are listening. I know that the staff at the Anthony Adrian Academy is listening. So is Tinkerbell 87. So is Denial. And thank you, Blanca J, for joining. I appreciate you. I value each and every one of you. The forecast says each family has their own way just as long as families start coming together as communities. That is a great answer. Each family has its own way. Every family has its own way, but families need to start coming together and organizing themselves and their economy, getting their financial literacy on board. You don't have to know how to do everything, but if you just know how to master one thing, if you just know how to get an insurance policy and pay for that, if you just know how to open up a trust, if you just know how to put your assets in a trust, if you just know how to organize an education, if you learn what a business plan is and how to set up a business, if you just master one thing, you'll be able to master anything. I thank each and every one of you for tuning in tonight, and I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Peace, guys.